Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Now today I'm back discussing another true crime case, and this time round it is a Jane Doe case. Now this one in particular really stuck out as kind of really interesting to me. There's a lot of different developments that occur throughout the case, so I thought it would be quite an interesting one to discuss with you guys. So as always, you can leave your thoughts down below. Any theories, any discussion are more than welcome in the comments section, but I am just going to get started with my regular disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all these videos. Essentially, I'm not claiming to be an expert by any means in any of the cases I cover on this channel, including this one. I'm only really relaying the information that I'm able to find online, accessing certain information. I cannot access everything, not everything is out there and available to me, so I apologise if I get anything wrong, mispronounce anything or leave anything out really. I'm not trying to do anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have accessible to me. And with all that being said, we shall just get started, and today we're going to be discussing the case of the CLEY Jane Doe. So this Jane Doe case takes place in the year of 1974 on the 27th of August in a place just outside of, I believe it's pronounced Swaffham, Norfolk in the UK. On the road named Brandon Road, heading in the direction of Brake Hill Farm, the headless remains of an unidentified woman were discovered with the legs and the arms bound together. The area of CLEY farmland that the remains were discovered on was actually owned by a man named Sir Peter Roberts, who at the time was a very respected politician for the Conservative Party, and he remained as such until the year of 1966. The discovery of these women's remains had been made by a 19-year-old boy named Andrew Head, and he had been working on one of the nearby farms in the area when he made this discovery. According to him, he had come across something on the ground that was covered and wrapped in like a plastic sheet, and so out of sheer curiosity he peeled back the sheet, just a little corner of it, just to see what was underneath, and peeling back this little bit of a corner was enough to tell him that he had just come across a set of human remains. So after he realised exactly what he had discovered, he very swiftly headed back to his home to call the local law enforcement and inform them of what he had discovered. It was discovered that on the plastic sheet that had been used to cover up the body, the words National Cash Registers, so abbreviated to NCR, had been written on it, almost like a branding. In addition to this discovery, law enforcement discovered that the woman to the unidentified remains had been wearing a pink night dress from M&S that they were able to date back as being sold and distributed in the year of 1969 throughout M&S stores. It was described in detail as being pale pink in colour, a short swing dress with a ruffled and jewelled neckline and hem. It wasn't an entirely uncommon style of night dress. At the time there was obviously a lot less difference and variance in the types of like nightwear that you could get and have access to, so a lot of people would have bought this dress. It wasn't for this particular style or type of person, so it was a very, very relatively, I guess, common dress. A number of sources stated that the remains appeared to have been deliberately hidden, as they weren't left to be found on like a pathway or a clearing. They were kind of hidden amongst a tall, overgrown patch of grass, as opposed to being, like I said, on an obvious track and also wrapped in this plastic. Investigators decided that they would need to do a thorough search of the surrounding fields in hopes of finding any other pieces of evidence that may be potentially vital to the identification of the remains, as well as being able to sort of piece together what had happened to this person. And they decided that the most efficient way for them to clear the fields and search the fields was through the use of combine harvesters. Following a closer examination of the body and an autopsy, it was believed that the woman was between the ages of 20 and 35 years old, and that she stood at around 5 foot 2 inches tall, and she was very, very small and kind of petite in her stature. And judging by the rate of decomposition, it was determined that she had likely died between 1 and 2 weeks prior to the discovery of the body. So in the early days of August of 1974, it was believed that she was killed. As I said, the remains had been discovered with the hands and legs bound together and a head missing, and this was never recovered. They never found the head, so the task of identifying this victim would prove to be an extremely difficult one, if not impossible. With what little information the police had to go on, they publicly appealed for any type of information they could regarding her identity, or maybe what had happened to her, if anyone had any idea who she was, or of a woman that maybe had gone missing on a certain journey, as they were not only looking for her name, but they were also looking for her killer and any sort of explanation as to what could have happened to her. And sadly, no headway was made in regards to the investigation into her identity, as she remains unidentified to this day. However, there have been some more recent developments in terms of other pieces of evidence that were found on the remains that day that potentially could point in the direction of some more developments made in the case further down the line. So there have been more recent investigations that have been kind of reopened and re-examined the case, which are particularly interesting. So as I said previously, the plastic sheet covering the remains had NCR printed on it, referring to National Cash Registers. A group of students in Dundee in Scotland more recently carried out a series of tests on the plastic as part of their forensic science studies, and they were able to come across evidence that they believe kind of proved the origins of the plastic sheet as well as the rope that had been used to tie the hands and the legs together. A company called Jute Factories in Dundee, Scotland, had been a huge factory involved in the manufacturing of a number of different items for a number of different companies, so they basically would be in charge of manufacturing and distributing a whole bunch of different types of products. But specifically of interest, they were at the time one of the main manufacturers of a number of products for national cash registers. A number of authorities actually made a statement that said that they believed that the specific type of rope that had been used on the remains was actually made with the intended use for machinery in agricultural fields and purposes. So they had this specific type of rope that was likely used in this sort of area of work, and so this kind of pointed towards them being able to either narrow down, like track down where it had been made, or track down the sort of area in which it could have been bought. And although these breakthroughs seem to be kind of relatively minor, they don't really tell you what happened to her, they don't really provide that many answers, they do allow for some certain avenues to be explored, some scenarios to be considered and theorised as to what could have potentially happened to this unidentified woman. So therefore, a number of different possible scenarios have come about and been developed and discussed, including the perpetrator of the crime against this Jane Doe may have simply purchased the rope and the plastic sheet in one location, and the two just happen to be manufactured in the same company because this company is hugely involved in a lot of different areas. One Reddit user has since suggested a possible scenario which is a little bit more intricate, which involved the perpetrator being an employee or an owner of a specific shop that had recently ordered a cash register from Jute Factories in Dundee, or more likely through National Cash Registers who had their products manufactured in Jute Factories in Dundee, and then the register arrived at the shop in the NCR plastic wrapping, and perhaps because of the shipping and the handling process, it was held together with this specific form of rope that was used in the attack. Similarly to this scenario, it could have been that the perpetrator of the crime had been involved in some sort of shipping and handling company, or even the delivery of these items in general, meaning that they had access to all of these equipment, all of this material that was then later used in relation to the attack. There was allegedly someone who was a collector of these specific cash registers and machinery and was able to provide authorities with the specific model of the cash register that had been used would have been stored in this plastic wrapping. So according to this alleged expert, so at least a collector, it was a specific model of payroll machine, but pretty much with this information at the most the investigators could have done was trace back to one of thousands of machines that were made and distributed by Jute Factories. So this didn't really narrow anything down apart from knowing the type of machine that had been inside the wrapping, because it would have been distributed to so many different locations around the country. Within the first year of the investigation, law enforcement spoke to over 15,000 people in hopes of gaining any sort of information into who she was, what may have happened to her, if anyone knew of anyone that could have potentially carried out this crime. And without an identity, they pretty much had no place to start their investigation. Past this, there really seemed to be no one who could place the woman as being someone that they knew of, and especially without a head, they really had a difficult task ahead of them. And nothing really came about in this case until the year of 2008, when it was decided that the body of the COCKLEY Jane Doe would be exhumed and re-examined after being buried for 34 years. Investigators were then able to extract new DNA samples from the remains as a means of using the more kind of recently developed techniques and methods in hopes of anything new being established that maybe couldn't have been detected in previous years, in early years of the investigations. From this, only a few very minor updates were really discovered. So not only were they able to determine that the woman had been dominantly right-handed, which is obviously quite interesting, but more interestingly, she had likely given birth at one point in her life, which was something they hadn't really anticipated beforehand. This discovery in particular came about when the investigator carrying out the post-mortem in the year 2008 noted that at her time of death, she had a widened pelvic girdle, which is a natural occurrence when the body is preparing itself for childbirth. Another interesting conclusion that they could make came about when a group of scientists decided to carry out a specific form of isotopic analysis that informs them of what type of water and sometimes even trace amounts of what food had been very heavily involved in their diet during their lifetime. So they were able to sort of place more likely where she was likely from or where she spent the majority of her life through this specific type of analysis. The trace amounts found in her body determined that she had consumed the most water originating in Scotland, confirming their belief that she was likely from Europe and specifically in the Scotland area, as well as having a high concentration of fish and crabs in her diet. The following year, in 2009, the Scottish serial killer Peter Tobin was in the process of investigation for a number of his attacks and crimes. He was going through a whole court process. It's a very, very complicated serial killer timeline there, and upon receiving a guilty verdict for the murder of Dinah McNichol, he was also investigated as potentially having some sort of involvement in this Jane Doe case. This likely came about as a result of the similarities in the timings and the locations. However, it was essentially ruled out, but it's just interesting to note that this avenue was explored. When I was researching the potential identities of this particular Jane Doe, there was one in particular that just kind of kept cropping up, and it seems to be the most supported and the most investigated avenue in relation to Jane Doe's identity. The Duchess was a name given to an infamous prostitute who was known to be active around the Great Yarmouth area for a number of years, but who actually disappeared in early 1974. Her real name wasn't known, and she was only ever really referred to as the Duchess. This is what she is known by. It's widely believed that the Duchess originated from Denmark, but was living the majority of her life in the UK. And aside from this, all that's really known about her background is that at some point in her life, she served a very short jail sentence for some undisclosed crime. When the Duchess disappeared, all of her belongings were found to be in their same safe place inside her home on the Great Yarmouth docks, and so it immediately seemed like an unlikely scenario that she had disappeared of her own accord, because literally everything that she owned was inside her home. She was known to have a number of clients through her years as being a prostitute who weren't from the local area. Many of them were like professional transport drivers, lorry drivers, who often stopped off in Great Yarmouth before heading on with the rest of their journey, with some of them even taking advantage of the ferry from the Great Yarmouth docks. So the majority of her clients were typically not from the local area. The Duchess's believed age would be between 20 and 30 years old, which would obviously match the approximated age of the COCKLEY Jane Doe, as well as the timings of the Duchess's disappearance and the discovery of the remains of the COCKLEY Jane Doe. They do kind of match. So the only thing really left to explain in this case would be the differences in location that took place between these two cases. However, this can actually very easily be explained by the profession of the Duchess. So not only, as I said, was she known to have a number of clients in Great Yarmouth who weren't from Great Yarmouth, likely travelling about, but she was also said to have travelled around the country with a number of her clients. So they would basically pay for her services, for her to come on their long haul journeys with them and stay with them before returning her back to Great Yarmouth. And this wasn't unusual. Sometimes these encounters would be like sexual in nature, whereas some of them were simply requiring company on their long haul journeys across the country. So it wasn't unusual for her to have some clients who requested that she stay with them for a number of days while they were travelling. And so it wouldn't really be unfathomable for the woman known as the Duchess to be the real identity of the COCKLEY Jane Doe, as it could have been that she travelled across the country with a client and it ended up in her sadly losing her life. So linking to this Jane Doe case more specifically, acting as though the real identity is actually the Duchess, if the perpetrator had in fact been a client of the Duchess's and also happened to be transporting National Cash Register products across the country, they would have access to both the specific forms of plastic and rope used in the attack. They would also be able to very easily transport the remains and conceal them in a quiet area, as they would likely have some sort of like lorry or big truck, anything that's used for transporting a lot of products on long haul journeys. And the traces of shellfish found as a common occurrence in her daily diet would also link directly to where the Duchess had lived for the majority of her life. And the only thing about this case that has no potential explanation thus far is the act of decapitation. It may have simply been a way of concealing her identity so that it couldn't be traced back to anyone. If maybe someone had seen this woman, if she'd been identified, leave with a certain person on a certain journey, it may have been just to protect the identity. But there may potentially be another explanation, other darker explanations. It might not have been as simple as this. People have speculated that the act of decapitation is not really something that a one-time attacker would carry out, as if anything it overcomplicates what they've got to do, especially if it's an unplanned attack, if it was one that just kind of happened on a whim, it was a bad situation. So it seemed more likely that this attack had been premeditated and a calculated incident, considering the fact that the victim's head has never been found. If it was slightly more on a whim, then it is likely that they wouldn't have hidden it as well. So the perpetrator has obviously done a very, very, very good job at concealing this part of the remains. It's baffling to consider the fact that it is likely a very premeditated murder. So despite all the similarities between these two specific cases, no conclusive links have been made between the Duchess and the COCKLEY CLEY Jane Doe, and it's not known for sure whether these two women are in fact the same person. And that really is everything that I have to discuss today. Let me know your thoughts down below. I'm sure there probably are other potential identities of the COCKLEY CLEY Jane Doe, but this seemed to be the only one really that I kept kind of seeing in my research. It was the only one that people really seem to be discussing, because I mean, I think you have to admit there are a lot of potential similarities between the cases. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts down below, and also let me know down below if you want to hear some more Jane Doe and John Doe cases. I find them really fascinating. A lot of them have a lot of kind of twists and developments that occur throughout the years of investigation, so let me know down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.